Anko winced. Oh man, reminds me of the time when I totally messed up that fire jutsu and burnt a hole right through my favorite shirt. Do you remember that? She launched into the story without waiting for an answer, providing a lot more grisly details than Iruka remembered from the last time she'd told him about it. Actually, it was comforting to hear about someone else's fuck-up. He'd felt so crappy about himself yesterday, like he was the only person who'd ever made a stupid mistake. Anko wasn't embarrassed at all about her story, she told it like one big joke, imitating her own panic and slapping at her shirt, bug-eyed, until Iruka was almost crying with laughter. Maybe one day Iruka's explosion mishap would feel like that. Maybe one day even Hound would look back on it and laugh. If he was capable of laughing. Iruka had never known him seem happy about anything, and suddenly that bothered him. Hey, Anko, he said once she'd grown tired of her own hilarity. How do you know if you like someone? Anko blinked at him. Where'd that come from, all of a sudden? I've just been thinking about it. Yesterday, someone told me they liked me. Someone who's usually kind of a jerk. Or at least I thought they were a jerk. We've argued a lot, but now I'm not so sure. Who is it? No one you know. Anko raised an eyebrow, and Iruka knew that wouldn't be the end of her curiosity, but she let it go for now. Well, how did you feel when they told you they liked you? She asked. Iruka tried not to wince as he remembered smacking Hound with the pillow. I panicked, he admitted. No one had ever just come out and said that to me before. Was your heart beating hard? Anko asked. It seemed a strange question, but Iruka answered honestly. Yeah, like I'd just run a lap of the whole village. And were you blushing? Probably. It was embarrassing. Anko raised a triumphant hand and poked him in the chest. Then you totally like her back. Wait. What? Her? Iruka asked, frowning. I never said it was a her. It was a guy. What? Anko yelped. She stopped walking and grabbed him by the arm. Iruka, she said far too loudly, you have a crush on a guy. No. Iruka glanced around the street, hoping to God no one he knew was in earshot. Why would you yell that? It's not even true. Sorry, Anko said in the loudest whisper Iruka had ever heard. I was surprised. You could have just said you liked guys at the beginning. Iruka hustled her off to the side of the street, out of the path of any passers-by. At least she'd chosen a residential street to yell about his sexuality and not the village center. Okay, first of all, it's not a crush. He doesn't have a crush on me and I don't have a crush on him. I meant like in a friendly way. Well, you didn't say that. And it sounds like a crush to me. You said you freaked out when he told you he liked you, who blushes over a friend. I wasn't expecting it. You've totally misunderstood. Iruka, Anko said seriously, I like you. Then she grabbed his wrist and took his pulse. Anko, Iruka spluttered, trying to squirm away. That doesn't count. Did you feel anything weird? Anko demanded. Any butterflies in your stomach? You're not blushing. Well, a little bit, but that's probably because I accidentally outed you to the whole street. You're already my friend. I know that you like me. It's not the same. But I've never told you before. And you weren't expecting it. If anything, you should have been touched that I was showing you my vulnerable emotional side. Iruka snorted at that and wrenched his wrist out of her grip. It was true that he didn't feel anything like the way he'd felt when Hound had said it, but that didn't change the fact that Anko had totally missed the mark. He wanted to be Hound's friend. That was all. Oh. And there it was. The answer he'd been searching for. I want to be his friend, he said, half to himself. I really do. Hey. I wonder why. Because he has a great ass. Anko suggested, and Iruka punched her in the arm. Ow. Hey, that was totally a yes, wasn't it? I've never even looked at his ass. You should, Anko advised. It might be a deal breaker. You wouldn't want to date a guy with a flat ass, would you? Iruka considered punching her again but decided it would only encourage her. You're the literal worst, he told her as he started walking again. She matched his pace and linked her arm with his so he couldn't escape. I know, she said. I try. Now tell me all. Iruka didn't touch his seals for 3 whole days after he got home from the hospital. He knew he'd have to eventually, and kept psyching himself up to go out and practice, but each time he got out his chakra paper and his notes, he couldn't bring himself to ink the seals. He kept remembering the ground smashing against his ribs and the blood-curdling terror that Hound had been hurt, and then he put everything away again. Tomorrow, he kept telling himself. I'll test them again tomorrow. Yet the third tomorrow rolled around, and Iruka found himself too busy with chores in the morning. Then he was called out for a D-class mission in the afternoon, and although there were still a few hours of daylight left, he decided that it was too late in the day and he would have to leave it until tomorrow again. He knew it was bullshit. But the guilt was not enough to help him overcome whatever stupid fear was holding him back. He was standing in the kitchen and waiting for the kettle to boil for a pot of instant ramen when he heard the window slide open from the living room behind him. The 2 rooms were only separated by the kitchen counter, but Iruka didn't turn around, too used to Umbu coming and going to feel alarmed. Besides, he didn't want whoever it was to see his feelings on his face. So he was surprised when someone spoke from right behind him. Curse that Umbu stealth, how did they move in such total silence? Making him yelp and jump about a foot in the air. What are you doing? Hound asked with clear disapproval in his tone. Don't do that. Iruka gasped, clutching a hand to his chest and closing his eyes while he calmed down. Couldn't you have said hi or something before you came to give me a heart attack? It wouldn't have been a very effective heart attack then, Hound said, so seriously that Iruka was sure it was the first joke he'd ever told in his life. The kettle boiled with a bubbling rush of steam before clicking off. Iruka reached for it, and Hound grabbed his wrist. What? Iruka asked, turning to frown at him. Hound was staring at the pot noodle with distaste. Shouldn't you be eating a real dinner? He asked. This is a real dinner. At least, it will be when you let me pour the water on it. Hound made a small sound of disgust at the back of his throat, and somehow Iruka suspected it was aimed at him rather than the noodles. I know for a fact that Viper brought you a whole box of fresh food after you got out of the hospital, Hound said. He swiped the pot noodle off the counter and then turned to Iruka's tiny fridge and opened it, therefore discovering the unused vegetables Iruka had shoved in there to slowly die of neglect. I was going to use them eventually, Iruka muttered when I figured out what to do with them. Didn't anyone ever teach you to cook? No, Hound sighed, put the pot noodle on the counter and started to help himself to Iruka's vegetables, piling them up on the tiny space Iruka had to prepare food on. He then shut the fridge and moved sinuously around Iruka to open the cupboards, searching through each one and pulling out a pan, a knife, a scarred and stained chopping board, and several other store-cupboard ingredients. He was lucky to find as much food as he did. Iruka's kitchen had 2 gas hobs, the tiny fridge and 4 cupboards, including the one under the sink which was full of mold. What are you doing? Iruka asked, trying not to get under Hound's feet and failing miserably. After Hound turned one more time and bumped straight into Iruka's chest, he simply took Iruka by the shoulders and gently but firmly removed him from the kitchen. Iruka stood on the living room side of the counter and watched bemusedly. I'm cooking you dinner, Hound said. Obviously. Then he plucked the apron off its hook on the wall, which Iruka never used but which had been a gift from Umbu, and so he couldn't throw it out, put it on over his armor and tied the strings into a neat little bow at the small of his back. Iruka had been almost positive he was awake and at home and not under some nefarious genjutsu, but he was starting to doubt himself. He said, and then Hound picked up the knife, tested it on his thumb and scoffed, and cast a quick jutsu which sharpened the blade to a gleaming edge, and Iruka decided not to argue with him. He watched in silence while Hound started washing the vegetables in the sink. You were meant to wash vegetables? Weren't they already clean in the shop? And then once the hiss of the tap had subsided, he finally found the words to ask a full question. Did you come over here just to cook me dinner? No, Hound said, eyes on the carrot he was currently dicing. The knife moved so fast that Iruka tensed, waiting for blood, but it never came. Although I might have done if I'd realized you were unable to feed yourself. I feed myself just fine. I came over, Hound continued, ignoring him, because Eagle said you were moping. Iruka scowled. I'm not moping. And then he realized what Hound had actually said, the meaning beneath the words. Wait, and you care if I'm moping? Hound moved onto a bell pepper, never lifting his gaze from the chopping board. He said you hadn't touched your seals at all, he said in that stiff tone he got whenever he had to say anything that wasn't directly related to missions or what an idiot Iruka was. And I thought maybe that was my fault. How did Eagle even know? Iruka stopped questioning it. Umbu weren't the best shinobi for nothing. It isn't your fault, Iruka said, looking out through the window at the grey concrete block of flats across the street. I don't know what's wrong with me. I just don't want to work on them anymore. The steady thunk of knife on wood slowed a little, and Iruka stared determinedly through the dirty glass because he knew Hound was looking at him. You're very good at seals, Iruka, he said suddenly. You shouldn't give up because you made one mistake. Because I made one mistake. Iruka hadn't talked about this with any of the other Umbu who had visited him over the past few days. A couple of them had asked meaningfully when he'd be getting back out on the training fields, but Iruka had been too embarrassed to tell them the truth. He'd fobbed them off with excuses, that he still had a headache, that he was busy, that he needed to study some more. Some of them had bought it, some hadn't, but none of them had pushed him like Hound was doing now. And, unexpectedly, Iruka hadn't felt the need to make excuses to Hound. He was still embarrassed and ashamed of his own weakness, and if Hound hadn't asked then he wouldn't have brought it up first, but he no longer hated the subject so much that he'd walk right out of the conversation rather than face it. It wasn't easy to talk about, but it didn't feel awful to get it off his chest. I don't want to hurt anyone, Iruka said very quietly. The chopping stopped altogether. Iruka still didn't meet Hound's gaze, though he no longer saw the street outside. Instead he was gazing back to the training field and watching the accident happen again like a ghost who was haunting his own past self. What if I go with you? Hound asked. When you try again. And this time I won't say anything stupid or get in the way. I was the one who did something stupid. Then all the more reason to make sure you get it right next time. Iruka thought about it. He thought about freezing up with Hound there as witness and his insides squirmed. This anxiety was bad enough when he was here on his own, he didn't think he could handle it with someone else there, judging him from behind a mask. Hound must have sensed his feelings, or perhaps his expression was giving him away, because the chopping resumed again, and Iruka thought he was going to drop the whole idea. When I first made Jounin, I fucked up my very first mission, Hound said. And when I say fucked up, I really mean it. I made a lot of bad decisions and one of my teammates died. Iruka's head snapped back to stare at him, wide-eyed. He'd never heard Hound talk about himself before. I could have given up being a shinobi then. Part of me wanted to. It would have been the easy thing to do. Maybe it would even have been for the best. I've seen other teammates die since then. But that's what being a shinobi is about. Sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, and that's just the way things are. He looked up and caught Iruka's gaze with his single dark eye. Iruka wondered which mission he'd lost the other one on. No offense, Iruka, but you're not strong enough to be a perfectionist. Not yet. Maybe you never will be. Very few shinobi ever get that strong. Are you that strong now? Iruka asked. Hound snorted softly. Far from it. Coming from an Umbu, that was more frightening than comforting. But that's what Hound was trying to say, that the level did not realistically exist where Iruka would stop making mistakes. It still wasn't comforting, but it was true. Iruka had two choices before him, he could carry on or he could quit. And despite the fear, he'd still found himself daydreaming up new traps and seals over the last 3 days. He wasn't sure he could ever truly get them out of his head. Being a shinobi gave him a purpose, and he wasn't sure anything else would ever make him feel that way. You're lousy at pep talks, he said. You're supposed to tell me I can do anything if I put my mind to it and believe in the power of friendship. Hound cocked his head to the side, bemused. Never mind, Iruka sighed. It was a joke. Hound seemed to still be seriously considering whether there was any merit to be found in the power of friendship as he put Iruka's old, dented frying pan on the heat and drizzled a little oil into it. He tipped in enough vegetables that Iruka was sure the pan was going to overflow, but somehow they all remained inside. It wasn't really a lousy pep talk, Iruka admitted after a silence broken only by the sizzling vegetables. Though don't think too much of yourself, it wasn't a great one either. I think maybe you do need to take some lessons on the power of friendship, Hound said drily. Your skills there could use a little work. Iruka leaned his elbows on the counter. Are you calling us friends? The wooden spoon jerked in Hound's hand and a piece of carrot fell overboard. Iruka thought that his ears looked a little pink and took delight in the thought that he might have made Hound blush. No, Hound said in the panicked, guilty tones of a child who's been caught with the stolen chocolate smeared around his mouth. Iruka laughed. Liar, he said. You said you liked me, remember? Hound shifted uncomfortably on the balls of his feet. Iruka thought he might be sweating. Do you even want to be my friend? Hound muttered. It was sort of cute how he could dish out savage life advice one second and squirm at his own soft, squishy feelings the next. I guess I can give you a trial run, Iruka said generously. Since your heart is so set on it. Hound cut him a look and then mumbled something that Iruka didn't catch. He reached out and picked up the kettle, and to Iruka's surprise he poured the still hot water over the noodles and set them aside to soak. Then he quickly splashed soy sauce into the pan, followed by a pinch of sugar and a spoonful of peanut butter. Iruka watched in fascination as he stirred these through the vegetables and then tipped in the noodles and their broth and turned off the heat. Did you just make me healthy ramen? Iruka asked. Hound folded Iruka's single-stained tea towel, put it down on the counter in front of him, and then set the pan on top of it, still steaming, followed up by a pair of chopsticks. Yes, he said. And now I have to go. He turned and walked quickly towards the window, then remembered he was still wearing the apron and paused halfway across the lounge to pull it off. Do you still want to help me not blow myself up? Iruka asked hesitantly. Hound folded the apron and laid it neatly on the couch. I'm free tomorrow afternoon, he said without looking up. And then he fled out through the window, defeated, Iruka thought with satisfaction, by Iruka's masterful command of the power of friendship. He took a small, hesitant bite of the healthy ramen. It was delicious. Iruka managed to show up on time, without an wake-up call, for tea with Sandaime the next morning. He had slept well the night before and he found that he was cautiously looking forward to practicing his barriers again that afternoon with Hound. He'd missed using his seals as much as he'd dreaded them, and he hoped that he would be more afraid of looking like a loser in front of Hound than of blowing someone up. Maybe that was the motivation he needed to get him started again. Viper was guarding the Hokage's office that morning, and she let him through with only minimal fuss. Oh, those bruises still look so dark, she sighed, making him hold up his arms for her so she could fret about the damage. Are you in pain, honey? Is it getting better? The bruises were still purple and blotchy, though some were turning a gross yellow color that Iruka was both disgusted and fascinated by. It's not too bad, he said. It's getting me out of taijutsu training, so it has its perks. That training is important, Viper scolded, as though she hadn't been cooing over his very mild injuries only a second ago. How will you ever get stronger with that attitude? Complaining about the training doesn't actually make it any less effective, Iruka said, and she swatted at him as she finally let him pass. Sandaime was waiting for him on the balcony again in their usual spot for tea. There was a chill breeze blowing the plume of steam from the teapot, and Iruka shivered as it fondled the back of his neck when he sat down. How are you feeling, Iruka? Sandaime asked as Iruka poured the tea. Of course he'd heard about the barrier incident too. Iruka had the terrible thought that maybe he also subscribed to the Iruka bulletin and wondered what other rumors he'd heard true or false about Iruka recently. If the leader of the village knew about his still unread copies of Ika he would die. The bump on my head has gone down, Iruka said. Can we not talk about it please? Sandaime gave him a sympathetic smile and nodded. You certainly seem your usual spry self, he said, and Iruka wasn't sure if he was being sassied by the goddamn Hokage, but it sure as hell felt that way. Actually, a change of topic suits me fine. I must admit, I've been looking forward to getting an update on your mission. My mission? Iruka asked before he suddenly remembered. Oh. The mission. Sandaime took a sip of tea, eyebrows slightly raised. Don't tell me you've given up on it already. No. I think I've, completed it. Those bushy eyebrows rose even higher. Already? My, I had faith in you but perhaps not enough. Do give me a progress report. How exactly was he supposed to summarize this kind of non-mission? Iruka stuffed a cream cake in his mouth as he thought about it, and Sandaime watched him patiently as he chewed, swallowed, and stretched out his tongue to try and lick the cream off his nose. I tried to be nice to Hound like you said, he said. And it had, mixed results. But he told me he liked me. I'm not really sure why he does. I don't think I was that nice. I could probably be nicer. Perhaps you haven't quite completed the mission yet then, Sandaime suggested. Friendship is a two-way street after all. Yet. Iruka wiped the back of his hand over his sticky lips in case he'd missed some of the cream. I'll work on it. I'm going to see him later today. And are you enjoying spending time with him? Not all of it, Iruka said honestly. He hadn't much enjoyed ending up in the hospital. But I guess he isn't the worst person ever. The corner of Sandaime's mouth quirked up. High praise, he said, coming from you, and this time Iruka was sure he was being sassied. Careful, he said. The spot for the worst person is now open. And he felt very pleased with himself when Sandaime laughed. By the time Iruka left with his weekly box of leftover cakes, he was in a good mood. He let Viper fuss over him a little more on the way out and promised her a cake if she came to see him later, and then he made his way down the stairs towards the exit. He barely made it to the ground floor. There was an Umbu waiting for him at the bottom of the stairwell, leaning back against the wall with his arms crossed tight over his chest plate. He wasn't looking at Iruka, but the impatient tap of his finger against bicep proved that he was waiting for him. Only when Iruka reached the bottom step, moving slower now, did the Umbu look up, and Iruka realized it was Hound. Oh, hey, he said, sensing that something was off but not knowing how to address it. I thought we were meeting up later. Are you free now? No, Hound said, and his voice was as hard as steel. And I won't be free later either. Okay, Iruka said slowly. He didn't move off the last step. What's wrong? Hound stood up off the wall and rounded on him, and Iruka instinctively tried to take a step back, his heel hitting the next step and almost sending him sprawling. I had a last-minute change of shift this morning, Hound said. I was meant to be out on patrol, but certain jobs take priority. If someone's off sick, we have to cover them. Did you know that there are always two Umbu guards outside the Hokage's office? One at the door and one with a view of the balcony. Iruka's chest felt suddenly very full and tight, like his rib cage had shrunk a size. He didn't say anything. How long were you planning to keep it up? Hound hissed. Your mission? It isn't like that. Iruka burst out. I mean, it was, but it's different now. Well, I'm glad you no longer think I'm the worst person ever, Hound said, and Iruka realized with a black horror that Hound was hurt. Not just angry, not just humiliated, but slashed right down to the bone. Iruka stepped down onto the stairwell floor. I'm sorry, he said. I'm really, really sorry. I didn't mean that, I was just being, what? Funny? He didn't see a single speck of humor in it now. Forget it, Hound said. It's my own fault for letting my guard down. I should have known you were just laying one more trap. Well, good for you. You caught me. Congratulations. He turned and slammed the stairwell door open, and then he was gone. Iruka rushed out after him, not knowing what to say to make this right, only knowing that he had to do something. He couldn't let things end this way. He didn't want to let things end this way, or at all. He didn't want to lose Hound when he'd only just learned what he'd be losing. But it was already too late.